District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Before I head on vacation later this month, I'm going to do a couple short deep dives into this newly cemented ticket, the Harris-Walz ticket. I've done a little bit of exploring here, but I need to dive deep a little bit further since I have produced quite a bit of material on these two in the last couple of days. So I want you to read my articles, but I'm going to do kind of a brief summary of these two individuals, what their agenda is relating to energy and conservation. So let's get right to it. I have an op-ed in the Washington Examiner reminding people where VP Harris stands on these issues. They talk about she has this evolution on fracking. This comes from a statement from her campaign staff, not her directly. So I have yet to believe, or I yet to credibly believe this is an evolution or a change of heart or anything. She's just saying this to be politically expeditious and advantageous to be competitive in states like Pennsylvania. But everyone and their mother knows that she has been on the record previously as calling to abolish fracking in 2019, 2020. And her and President Biden, as part of the Biden-Harris administration, have done a lot to undermine the practice as well. So I write how America must unburden itself from Harris's climate agenda at Washington Examiner on behalf of Independent Women's Voice, which is our C4 at IWF. And I mention, and I remind readers where VP Harris stands on the issue. She was an original backer of the Green New Deal. She claimed climate change is an existential threat to the U.S., and she and President Biden, as I note in the article and I've talked about here, are committed. She, like Walz, is committed to charting a net zero course. So this is why I don't believe she has evolved. I don't believe she's had a change of heart, because she has said numerous times her name co-signed onto Biden's. Every resolution, every declaration, every proclamation, every rule finalization that has anything to do with energy and climate always goes back to President Biden's day one executive order to go net zero by 2050, to fully decarbonize the economy by 2050. A year, a deadline when most of these people will be gone and likely not alive, let's be honest. So they're setting guidelines and deadlines for a time when they might not be around. So of course, there's a lot of questions over that. Vice President Harris, heaven forbid if she were to become president, would perpetuate and even worsen President Biden's war on energy. She has said that we have to go with electric buses, with solar, with wind, full electrification. She is so beholden to full electrification. That's why I'm not convinced she's for keeping fracking in place. She's saying this now to assuage concerns of people in Pennsylvania who might be open to voting for her, because there are a lot of independent voters. But history and her records show that she's not a friend to fracking. You talk to anyone in the fracking industry, I know a couple people up that way in Northwest Pennsylvania, they dread having her come to office, or stay in office rather. Her being elevated to president from VP. They don't trust a word she says. They dislike Biden's policies on energy, and they're going to be even more doubtful and fearful and skeptical of her so-called evolution. Natural gas, of course, is abundant, clean, safe to use, and it is within the public interest. LNG exports are within the public interest, as one federal judge has said. They were rebuked. Biden and Harris were rebuked for pausing LNG exports. I have no doubt Vice President Kamala Harris was very much involved in having TikTok influencers and climate activists try to get them to change their policy there, or to reverse the policy of LNG exports, or to abolish them altogether. Secretary Granholm said, we're going to revisit this and lift the pause, after the election. We're going to promise to lift it. So this was a caving to radical environmentalists. I have no doubt VP Harris had some involvement, heavy involvement there. It seems like she does with all these decisions. And I want to remind everyone that these so-called clean energy industries that Harris and Biden are boosting, because, again, she co-signed on all this. Solar isn't doing well. Solar is about to collapse. Major residential solar installer, as I know in my article, is expected to declare bankruptcy soon, adding to the dim prospects of this fledgling industry. Wind isn't doing well either, because wind generation is down for the first time in several decades. It declined 2.1% wind speeds. First time to see this decline since the 1990s. Also, offshore wind. Have you guys seen what happened in Nantucket? They have paused construction of the Vineyard Wind project, and more projects are going to be facing scrutiny. There have been many concessions too. Last summer, this industry, offshore wind, was almost on the verge of collapse. I'm surprised it's still being kept afloat. Thank you, Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, artificially propping up these projects. But many people have conceded that offshore wind is untenable and likely doomed, even with the backing of subsidies. Even more worrying is how Vice President Harris sees climate policy, largely as a way to advance redistributionist policy. So we keep hearing this jargon stemming from some legislation she had heralded and promoted and co-signed onto and was a lead sponsor on during her time in the U.S. Senate. So she's all into environmental justice, climate justice, and having everything relate back to that. So every government program relating to mitigating climate or boosting energy has to now have caveats or considerations for underserved communities, indigenous knowledge, all these extraneous factors which have nothing to do with energy. And they claim to help people in underserved communities. They're going to be seeing some sort of redemption or some boosting or alleviating of any pain or effects of pollution or other environmental problems. But everything is tied to, and she'll perpetuate, the Justice 40 initiative, which gives 40% of federal investments to underserved communities under the guise of fighting climate change. She loves to talk about electric school buses. The Clean School Bus Program, which is aligned with Justice 40, has only delivered 60 school buses for $5 billion. And school buses, according to Thomas Catenacci of the Washington Free Beacon, formerly of Fox News, he had uncovered that these electric buses cost 3 times as much as diesel buses. Crazy report, you got to read it. And environmental justice programs are wrought with corruption, as I note, don't help those affected by pollution or any other environmental problem. A report or investigation, rather, into environmental justice, one particular program under the EPA, their Collaborative Problem-Solving Cooperative Agreement Program, 90% of that spending from the American Rescue Plan went to overhead costs instead of helping people who it was supposed to help, those afflicted by pollution and other environmental problems. So she wants to have, much like Walz, energy policy that promises all this lofty stuff, but actually is like a payback to their environmental backers. It's not going to help disadvantaged communities. It's going to rise the cost of your energy bills. It's not going to solve any environmental problems. It's going to claim you're fighting a so-called climate crisis, even though we are at historic lows of any climate-related deaths. There's a 96% decrease over the last 50 years in so-called climate-related deaths. Situations are improving. We have clean air, clean water, even with a flourishing economy. At best, if you want to follow net zero dictates and directives, if you were to follow that according to the Paris Climate Accords to reduce it by 1.5 degrees Celsius, at best, what estimates show, if you upend the economy, you destroy the economy to pivot to a net zero economy, at best, you're going to destroy our GDP, 7 trillion, even more. I think our economy is worth maybe $25 to $30 trillion. So you're going to totally destroy the economy, but you're only going to reduce temperatures at best 0.2 degrees Celsius instead of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So little gains for mass destruction of the economy, little environmental benefit. That is what you have to know about net zero. So I explained that there. And I also want to briefly touch upon Tim Walz's, because I always forget there's no T. So Governor Walz has a pretty radical climate record himself. And I want to debunk a little bit or demystify how much of a sportsman he is. I actually just talked about this on Brady Leonard's podcast, the No Gimmicks podcast today. So you can find that conversation in the show notes. But I want to give you guys kind of a clip notes, top line summary of what I feel about seeing Sportsmen. And I've touched upon this in a previous episode here on the podcast too. But no amount of blaze orange or pheasant hunting pictures or content showing wildlife assuages my concerns about Governor Walz's positions. Where has the guy stood on the Second Amendment? He's like, I support the Second Amendment, and I was carrying weapons of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and apparently he was never in combat in these war-torn zones. At best, he was in Italy. He never saw Iraq or Afghanistan as part of being enlisted in the National Guard. That's a total and complete lie. So that video that has been circulating about him being a hunter, I support gun control because it's aligned with the Second Amendment, totally bunk. He never carried AR-15s or any so-called weapons of war. So stemming from that revelation of him lying and exaggerating his record, we can examine where he stands on sportsmen's issues. Where has he stood on critical sportsmen's issues? He supported gun control. Now everyone's like, well, there are hunters who are for gun control because you don't need to hunt with an AR-15, or you don't need this type of caliber, or you only need to hunt with a certain type of tool, and anyone who hunts like this is not a real hunter. I hate these bravado arguments. We deal with this enough, but Governor Walz is an encapsulation of that, the kind of restrictionist hunter, the one that a lot of anti-gunners and radical environmentalists like to go to and prop up as like the example hunter, the prime example hunter that everyone emulates, the type of hunter everyone thinks is in the majority opinion, but it's not. He's actually quite in the minority. But he supported gun control on numerous occasions, most recently red flag laws and universal background checks. According to the Rand Corporation, universal background checks actually do not reduce crime whatsoever in terms of violent crime involving firearms. It's inconclusive, and it's not shown to do that. And he has put in some other measures. But by implementing gun control and then saying you shouldn't use an AR-15 because it's a weapon of war, what does that amount to? Not only a deprivation of rights, but it also is a diminishment of conservation funding. I have to look over and see if there is a correlation between Walz's support for gun control and this diminishment of conservation funding, especially under Pittman-Robertson, that goes to Minnesota. I bet you we will find a correlation in the forthcoming years, what that means. $28 million in PR funding would be jeopardized if more gun control policies materialized. And there's this whole thing about the camo hat. Some people had only just looked at like the cultural implications of it because they basically ripped it off of a pop star, Chappelle Roan, I think that's her name, because she has a camo hat. But there was a lot of interesting issues over what type of hunting camo pattern was used. It was actually a Realtree pattern, but not directly from Realtree itself because of just the entanglement in terms of how camo is licensed and third parties can buy a licensed camo print and then use it up to their discretion. So obviously Realtree had no involvement whatsoever. I gather that the Jordans do not support Harris-Walz whatsoever. So Tyler Jordan had to come out, the son of the founder who is involved in strategic partnerships, had to come out and say that we're not involved. Please don't cancel us. So there was a lot of controversy over that. But this whole thing about the camo hat becoming an iconic status for Democrats who don't like hunting and fishing and Second Amendment makes no sense to me. And like I noted on my Substack, there are legit Democrat hunters and anglers who probably would disagree with Walz on gun control and his different positions. There are plenty of left of center hunters who may not fully agree with their party on certain positions as it relates to sportsmen's issues. I'm not sure where they fall on wolf management. Some of that could be very dicey. But Walz, as I noted in both my town hall column and also my Substack, he's kind of like this FUD character, F-U-D-D, Elmer Fudd, kind of this like lackadaisical character, someone who is not representative, or rather someone who actually betrays sportsmen and gun owners because it's politically convenient for him to do so. So to me, Tim Walz, when I look at his sportsman record, when I look at his climate record, I just don't see how he's a friend to conservationists, true conservationists, if we're trying to be honest and authentic here. And Sportsmen, he has yet to declare a National Shooting Sports Month proclamation. I'm told he may in the coming weeks. First time in his 6 years in office, whoop-de-doo. It is, the first time in 6 years? It's election year? Coincidence much? But again, he's the type of hunter, as I've mentioned online and in my writings, that is kind of a FUD, who would betray you when it's convenient for him, and he's shown time and time again that he would. He hasn't joined in on calling his fellow blue state governors to knock off the attacks of hunting by radical appointments to their fish and wildlife game and to restructuring or reimagining wildlife agencies. I bet you he has installed people in his wildlife agency and his DNR that are not in full agreement with hunting and fishing or who may support the dissolution of hunting and fishing as conservation tools. if you examine who he has appointed, I bet you'll find those types of people there too. So where is he calling out the anti-hunters, the people who are remaking conservation? He claims to be a conservationist. He claims to be a hunter, an upland bird hunter. Don't see him condemning those efforts. And again, he capitulates on the wolf issue. He claimed that he did support wolf management, but now if they were delisted, he wouldn't. A lot of flip-flopping there. So sportsmen and women also look to a plethora of different issues, a multitude of different issues, even beyond conservation and Second Amendment. But Second Amendment and conservation are very important to people. But they also look beyond these issues too, and they see that you can't trust this guy. He's extremely radical. He will sell you out as a sportsman for progressive values. And that's what you have to make of it. He's not going to moderate his tone. Neither will Vice President Harris. Harris is not a friend to hunters. I've never seen her make any gesture that is positive towards hunters, anglers, conservationists. She's going to perpetuate policies like 30 by 30, which is actually a derivative of California's marine life protection areas, which basically cut off recreational access, fishing access permanently, never was restored. It borrows a lot of those elements. I mean, just look at what she's done, co-signed with Biden on federal lands, restricting hunting, on national monument designations, the lead prohibitions on national wildlife refuges. She has basically signaled support for that through Secretary Deb Haaland, through these other people who are helming these agencies. So you have to look at her record, you have to look at Walz's record, and you'll see that it is very much not in favor of sportsmen and women, gun owners whatsoever. And you have to make that determination yourself. That's what I've concluded for myself. I have the evidence to back it up. You can read it. I'm not just making this up out of thin air. But it just seems to me that this would probably be the most anti-hunting, anti-gun owning ticket we've ever seen before in a presidential election cycle. So that has me worried. And no amount of backpedaling through spokespeople can reassure me and give me confidence that these people are not going to erode our heritage and our rights further. They're going to double down. I don't want to wait till finding out that they're elected to know what they really stand for, because I know this already even before the election. I know where they stand on. I hope you know where they stand on, and you can deduce and conclude that a lot of what they propose and they support is anathema to the sportsman, sportswoman's way of life. It is. Let's be honest. I'm not going to pull any punches. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. They are anathema. Their policies are anathema to our way of life. And if we do not spot this ahead of time, we will unfortunately invite our demise if this ticket were to prevail. What do you think about the Harris-Walz ticket? Do you think they are in favor of sportsmen's rights and our heritage? You might disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine, but I think there's enough evidence to support that they don't support us. Let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.